Your name, sir, is synonymous with the Singapore Civil Service. Not only were you one of the first to join the ranks of our new administrative service, you rose from sort of the lower rungs right to the very top. How was it like, those early days, when we were forming a new civil service? I mean, I assume that you were slowly trying to wean away from the British civil service. Is that right?
Yeah, it wasn't the only form, so it was a very old service. But before that, under the colonial government, quite a different situation. So when I came in, it was the first time we had internal self-government with the PAB, fully elected government. Of course, we did control defense, we did control foreign affairs, but internal self-government. So situation was different, but you had to really work for the people rather than being told what to do by the colonial authorities. So that was, I think, more a question of approach rather than anything else. And I came into the civil service. My first posting was the Ministry of Finance.
Right.
And the minister there was Dr. Goh Keng Swee. And there was a lot of sort of jobs to be done because the new system is becoming in, the old colonial system is out, the new system, self-governing is in, so there's a lot of systems. So there's a lot of work to be done, especially new work to initiate new work. And my boss pushed most of the stuff that he had been asked to by Dr. Goh to do. He passed it on to me.
Passed it on to you, right.
And he must have put his work up to Dr. Goh, but to be fair to him, he didn't claim it as his own work and must have said that it was my work. So at some point of time, then Dr. Goh called me up one day after I was in the service for about 50 until about almost 3 years, 2 years plus. He called me to his office one day, and I was a very young junior officer. I had only maybe 1 or 2 occasions before that I ever go to his office for anything. He called me to his office and then told me, he says, well, you're posted to the Prime Minister's office as a secretary. I said, when? He said, now.
Oh.
I said, what do you mean now? I said, yeah, you go over.
Wow.
And then I went into the Prime Minister's office as a secretary. That position today is called the PPS, the Principal Private Secretary, but those days it was called Secretary to PM.
So, in a sense, your career quite often coincided with Dr. Goh, right? Because in the Defense Ministry, you were there too, isn't it?
Yeah, in fact, well, the finance I started off with it.
Yeah.
Then it was Prime Minister's office.
Yeah.
Well, the Prime Minister's office, separation from Malaysia took place.
Yeah.
Well, actually, it was the Prime Minister's office. We went into Malaysia.
Right.
We were in Malaysia, came out Malaysia.
Right.
And when we came out from Malaysia, I was literally posted to Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Right.
And my job was to organize and be the sort of secretary to the delegation.
Right.
Of the delegation led by Dr. Chotin Chai and Foreign Minister Mr. Rajaratnam to go to the UN to get admission of Singapore to the UN as a member. And then with the delegation go on a goodwill mission to a number of African states. Tanzania, Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Malawi, whole lot of states. And then Tunisia, Algeria, and even to Moscow, USSR, then Yugoslavia, Burma, then called Burma, Cambodia, Thailand, and Singapore back again.
Wow.
So I was posted on that one. So I went on the delegation. We were living for about almost 2.5 months out of a suitcase.
Easily, yeah.
Just traveling from place to place to place. And those days travel is not very easy, especially in Africa. Sure. And then when I got back to Singapore at the end of that thing, the day I landed at the airport, there was a welcome committee there, and then the delegation, Dr. Tochin Chai and Mr. Rajaratnam were giving speeches. And while that was happening, I went into the VIP room in the airport there to sort of get a bit of rest, and met Dr. Goh, and he laughed and said, ha 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 ha, you're coming back to my ministry. I said, what do you mean? He says, that was I got back somewhere around over the weekend.
Right.
Said, Monday you're reporting to the Ministry of Interior and Defense, you're coming here.
There you go.
So, that was it.
Yeah.
And then, so I worked with him there,
Yeah.
the defense, and then later I was back again in the Ministry of Finance after some time, and then later again in MAS.
What was it like working with Dr. Goh at such close range? I mean?
I think one thing about him is that he's made of ideas, and always on the go. Always wants to get some things done. A lot of new ideas. Very creative, but very impatient. I think I got on fairly well with him, but of course, we had ups and downs and things like that. Well, I can't say ups and downs because he was always up and always down.
How was it like in terms of climbing the ranks? Like, what were your bosses looking for? Was it diligence? Was it imaginative creativity? What was it?
Depends on who you're working for and what you're working on. There's some like the PM Lee Kuan Yew, for instance. When I worked with him that time, that was some of the most difficult times.
Right.
So, and I think he was very suspicious of everybody, no matter who you are. So you don't get a full story from him. You got to try and figure out. And I remember one day, I did something, and then when he found out about it, he came back and said, "No, I did do something." But he came back and said, "Why did you do this?" I said, "You didn't tell me." He said, "How long have you been working for me?" I said, "About 6 months now." He said, 6 months, you can't read my mind?
Wow.
So this is sort so that's the way of working. Others got different ways of working.
So some people say he had a bad temper. Is that right?
Yes, he has got a quick temper. I would say quick temper. But I think you have to realize, I think, that the pressures that he was under, and especially during that time when I was there from 1962 to 65, the pressures which I think he carried on his own, which very few were privy to, because of he did very suspected almost everybody. So only a very few, like Dr. Koh Keng Swee, Rajanandam, Mr. Barker, were really privy. The rest of others, he never get a full story. So because of that, he's working under pressure, and because of the pressure he's under, he loses his temper. And sometimes because you're not privy to everything, you don't do the right thing, or you don't do the thing at all. So you get into trouble. So he loses his temper. But of course, then later, of course, but he'll never say sorry. But he relents.
Sure. Can you describe for us some of the most significant changes, perhaps, or transformations that took place between the old colonial service, the self-governing Singaporean service, and then the Malaysian years, and then the post-Malaysian years? How did you think the civil service changed? I mean, one or two significant pointers or examples.
The transition from the colonial time to the first self-governing thing was something which I did really participate in. But the real change, I think, was one that you work, because you're working as an elected government, working for an elected government.
Right.
So you got to make sure you deliver the goods. So you got to deliver the goods to the people. So that's the way of working. You don't take top-down sort of measures, but you also have to get the feedback from the bottom and work towards that. What
was the ground? How would you define the ground in terms of civil service?
The ground, I think that it was very much because initially after the colonial period, the self-governing, internal self-governing period, most of them were sort of not sure. Civil service not sure what needs to be done. Even ministers, some of them were not very sure. So it's a question of getting directive from the cabinet to the minister down. So it goes out that way, all the way down.
Did that work in Malaysia as well, during that short time in Malaysia?
During the Malaysia, it was different because Singapore had control of most of the things except for defense, for foreign affairs, defense. The rest of it, Singapore controlled. The police was under, also security is under Malaysia.
Right.
So apart from that, we sort of ran ourselves. But the only problem was that one of the reasons why we went to Malaysia was to get the common market, and that was a lot of bickering going on and arguing, and so it never really took off.
When you talk about societal leadership, and we're doing these interviews for the Institute of Societal Leadership here at SMU, one of the areas of discussion is continuity in leadership, and that societal leadership demands a kind of continuity which, say, political leadership, even if it demands, may not often obtain. And to put it more bluntly, people say political leaders come and go, but permanent secretaries are bosses that stay on, That's why you call permanent. What's your take on that?
I think the only permanency is that this is a title that came from the British Civil Service, where we had permanent secretaries, and that was to distinguish the permanent secretary of civil servant from the political secretary of state or secretary of whatever it is, who came and got because of the elections. So that's the only permanency about the position. Nothing else was permanent.
But sir, now that you've taken up the analogy yourself, you know how when watching Yes Minister, all right, the permanent secretaries have the other guys around their little finger, man.
That's what the permanent secretaries like to think.
But seriously speaking, I mean, one of the later discourses of Ngiam Tong Dao and others have been precisely what is the role of permanent secretaries, role of senior civil servants. What's your take on that? But you must have been caught in that role many times, right?
I think it's really what the role that you play as a public secretary is the role that your minister and his cabinet colleagues want you to play. You know, some of them want you to be an advisor.
We're talking about the relationship between the political leadership and the leadership at the civil service level. People say that while the political guys come and go, the civil servants at the very top remain. Let me put it another way. In terms of discussing this nature of that relationship, if you had a very disagreeable minister in charge of the ministry, how would you negotiate your views with such a person?
I think if that sort of situation did arise, the permanent secretary wouldn't be there much longer. You know, I mean, either he himself would initiate a transfer out, or the minister would initiate a transfer out, or maybe even if it's worse than that. But you know, it cannot get to a stage where you're so disagreeable you can't really work together. It's impossible.
I'm sure, sir, in your role as PermSec over many years, some of the junior officers at some point may have cornered you or sought your advice. Like, how do you get on with difficult bosses, or how do you get on with difficult decisions from the top that you don't agree with? What kind of advice did you give them in those situations?
They don't give them advice, I give them instruction.
Oh, you give them instructions. What did you instruct them? Obey.
Go ahead and do it.
Oh, go ahead and do it.
If you don't agree, you don't want to do it, then you resign, you quit.
So, if you had a young officer who really was quite good, but had difficulty in, say, from an ideological point of view or some similar such that prevented him from automatically saying yes, sir, were there areas in which the civil service during your time allowed for those kinds of opt-out, but not opt-out of the system altogether?
I don't know whether this is an example that fits the scenario that you painted, but when I was in Ministry of Education, there's this thing about priority for admission to schools for those who had abortions.
Right.
We had asked to put this into effect. Mr. Yi Peng Liang was sort of in charge of all the Catholic schools and all that. Right. He came to me at Ministry of Education and said, this is something that we cannot do. You can't ask our Catholic schools to when they go to registration, you give them a power. We cannot do this.
Sure.
I said, what's the objection? He says, because our teachers are Catholic, our nuns are Catholic, you can't ask them to do this. I said, okay. I tell you what, if I send an officer from the Ministry of Education who's not a Catholic to go to your school, to any one of the schools, and register those for one priority because of abortion, will you be prepared to accept that? And he said, let me think about it. Then he came back later and said, yes, I spoke to the school, they agreed.
Okay.
So this is so that is an example of where there is a possibility of overcoming let's say, even the religious belief to do this. So if you can find a solution like that that's workable, compromise, and all are prepared to accept, then you go ahead and do it. But if you cannot, then just too bad.
Was the civil service in the initial years of Singapore's independence very bent on doing what it felt it should do, what it was impelled perhaps to carry out because of the very strong Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, and whether that, looking back now, was always the right thing to do, especially in these days when we think that the connectivity with the people on the ground is ever so important, both for the political leadership as well as for the civil leadership?
I think, to a large extent, to answer your question, in this respect, I had one of the best teachers possible. In my early days, I went to the PM Lee Kuan Yew's office, right, and there was the elections of 1963, right, just after the referendum to go to Malaysia. Then going into Malaysia, there was elections held. I had to follow around with him to all the constituencies, 51 constituencies everywhere. He used to give a talk. Right. We had to organize platform stages and all. They stopped and gave him a talk and all that. And the ground level swell there was not really all in favor, because many still worked up against Malaysia. Like various problems, resettlement problems, all a lot of. But I could see, the way we went down to suddenly, like say Potong Pasir, you stand there and give a talk. And when he starts off with, you can feel that The antagonism is there in the air. By the time he finishes off, he's such a good persuader. The people come up and clap to him, and the old women come down and kneel in front of him. I mean, so the way of persuading, you can move the ground to the way you want to. But he did that, I think, all because he saw this is for the benefit of the people in the long run. Now you may not accept, you think it's a bad thing, but in the long run, this is to your benefit. But you can swell, turn the tide round.
How often, say in your personal experience, did the ministers, the political leadership, gather all of you, either collectively or singly, to get your advice on critical decisions that they were going to make?
I think very few ministers ever did that. But Lee Kuan Yew did it as a prime minister. From time to time, he'll call all the permanent secretaries to the room, the cabinet, and maybe one or two other ministers might be with him there. And he'll ask, what do you think of this? What do you think of this? And he listened to you. And at the end of the day, he might have made up his mind. But whatever he said has gone into the bill.
What are your views about leadership? What do you think makes for good leadership? And what are the kind of qualities you want to find in a good leader?
Vision, drive, and to be a good and successful leader, you must have a bit of a devil in you. If you're all compassion, you get nothing done. So very often, like a doctor, sometimes you got to hurt the patient in order to cure him. So a good leader must be the same thing. You give in to everything, then you're not a leader. You are being led. So I think these are the main qualities that you must have.
What about moral turpitude? Is a question that's becoming very big today, where you have very efficient leaders in certain sectors of society, but in terms of the morality that they practice, some of us think that might be quite a lot left to be desired. How would you sort of...
I don't know. I think I'm a bit of a skeptic there because having studied philosophy in university, what is ethics, what is moral, what is right and what is wrong, it's very difficult. But I think one thing when, say, the PAP first came in, one of the first things that PM Lee Kuan Yew did was insist on incorruptibility, no corruption. And that was, I think, one of the very good things that he did. And I tell you, when I first joined Ministry of Finance, I was a very young officer, and one of my jobs was sort of helping to recruit for various, getting applicants and all that. And one day, one of the officers working with me, one young clerical officer came to me and said that these applications had been received in the post, and this is one letter from somebody, young man, offering $50 if he got this job. So the officer said, "What shall I do with this?" So I said, "Well, let me take it to my boss." I took it to my boss. I asked him, I said, "What do with this?" He said, "Just ignore it. This is not important." I said, "But they don't want to harm this man, who's a young boy. Obviously, he's a young boy. And offering only $50. But I think at the same time, we must drive home a message to him." He said, "How would you do it? If I ask you to, how would you do it?" I said, "Well, can't we call up the CPIB? CPIB is set up that you're my boss. You talk to the boss of the CPIB, tell him this one, and ask him whether he or his officer can call up this young man and explain to him that this is something wrong, so he will not do it again, and he will pass the message along." My boss said, "Yes, that's an idea." So he called up the CPIB boss. CPIB thought it was a good idea also. So he arranged to call up the young man. And so, this is something you can see that, that even at that stage, the best of incorruptibility had been put there, has gone all the way down. And the PM in those days would walk around the constituencies and tell, what corruption and all that. He said, "If I take money from somebody, my minister will take money, my permanent secretary will take money, and the postman will take the stamps off the letter." I said, these are examples that go down to the ground. So this, I think, are very, very, very important.
How will you look at societal leadership? This whole idea of societal leadership.
I don't really know what societal leadership is. I know what leadership is. And I think all leadership is societal. If you're a leader, you're a leader of a group of people, right? So if you're a group of people, a group of people can be a society. It is a form of society. So every society has its own sort of culture. That is societal leadership. Every form of leadership is societal leadership.
So you wouldn't make a distinction, say, between civil leadership, political leadership, religious leadership, other kinds of leadership. You would say that all leaders actually should
Not just
subscribe to the core values of a thing called leadership?
No, they don't have need the same qualities for all types of leadership because if you're a military dictatorship, what you need is guns and power. If you're fully elected, you need the persuasive power and ability to deliver the goods. So it depends on. But even the military dictatorship, if you don't deliver the goods at the end of the day, one of those days they're going to kick you out. So you will be leader. So you still have to do the minimum.
All right, so I want to round this interview up by asking you to help us maybe draw attention to a couple of leaders that you personally admire. But before I do that, would you have some thoughts to share on our late leader? I mean, now that we are mourning the loss of Mr. Lee Kuan Yew.
I don't know, looking back now, the other time I didn't appreciate it, but looking back now with the 1962-65 when I was secretary to PM, and working in very difficult times. The sort of vision that he had for Singapore as a whole, and how he went about working about it, something that's very admirable. Although at that time, you get the fallout, the brunt of the problem, and you say, what the hell am I here for? But later on, even, not too much later on, you see that what he's done. And I think that more than anything else, I think he's a leader that you can put on a pedestal anywhere in the world, and he'll be also accepted. But of course, sometimes they say, well, maybe he's this person that Australia should get or something. But I've told people if he goes to Australia as a prime minister, there'll probably be the biggest riot in the world. So it's not everywhere that this would work, but he carried this. So I think more than anything else, I think the vision and the drive and forceful and the one single-mindedness of which he can push it through. But at the same time, a very high degree of pragmatism where if the road is moving on, seems to him the wrong road, he'll just cut it off and go and stop. Like Singapore into Malaysia, that was the only, in fact, he persuaded everybody to vote in favor as the only possible viable solution for Singapore. When it was found to be unworkable and we threw out, he tried to shed some tears, but at the same time, he said, move on to something new. So that ultimate pragmatism, I think, is very hard to find in any other leader.
So added to those qualities of leadership that we talked about earlier on, would I suppose be the idea of decisiveness?
Decisiveness, I said you must have decisiveness with a vision.
With a vision, yeah.
Not decisive, this is something that hurts me, I cut it off.
Right.
What do I do after that?
Right.
I cut off my both legs.
Yep.
How can I walk?
Right. Now, apart from Mr. Lee, did you have a lot of time and admire any other Singaporean leader up to now?
No, I worked a lot, in fact, more with Dr. Goh than with Mr. Lee. And he also is someone I admire, but for his intellect, very great intellect, and the ability to jump from something all over the place. The creation of the Singapore Bird Park.
Yes.
This is his idea. The reason why I wanted to say, well, Jurong going to be a dead place with all factories and all that, and they want to bring people to live there. So he said he must have something. So Jurong Bird Park came up. A lot of things that came. The zoo came. His idea. He's the one who decided you must have a zoo. Singapore Orchestra.
Yeah, symphony.
Orchestra. His idea. A lot of things where out of we think is out of his realm. Which is finance and economics. He does.
So anecdotally, all right. Anecdotally, you worked for both the men. Where do you think there was a difference between these two sort of giants in their own right?
But they're very difficult. Well, for one thing, just an example, when Dr. Goh was Minister of Interior and Defence,
right.
He goes on nitty-gritty. One day he asked someone forming the battalions, a number of people required, why do you need so many? You see 5 people to man that one gun. He said, well, one guy is to do this, the other guy is to do this, this one, the guy, this one, the 4th guy. I said, what about the 5th guy? He said, nobody knows. So what the hell, what is that for? So nobody knows. So he traced back and found that this were the days when the guns were towed by donkeys or horses. And the 5th man was to hold a donkey. To make sure it doesn't run away and he fires it. And you see, till today you still got a person there. We are short on manpower, take it off. So these are the sort of, he's got these ideas. Nobody else thinks about it,
Right.
but he does.
Right, right. And on the world stage, who would be one or two leaders that you have admired?
Well, you know, I was one time High Commissioner to South Africa,
Yes.
and I met Nelson Mandela personally in my own capacity, and also accompanied PM Lee Kuan Yew when he was not PM then. Went there to see Mandela, and then subsequently when Mandela was installed as president, I think Mandela is one of the most outstanding leaders that I've come across. Early on, when I went on an mission with Dr. Tojin Chai and Rajaratnam, Mr. Rajaratnam, to go to UN, and then, you know, African countries that go around. The two people that struck me the most on that trip was Jomo Kenyatta and his Attorney General then, Tom Mboya, who was assassinated.
Right.
Tom Mboya, I found, was a very charismatic man, and even though after I read about him, you know, was a great leader in his own right, he was assassinated. And then, of course, you know, amongst people, others I met on that same trip, Prince Sihanouk, Cambodia.
Right.
In his own right, he was, at one time, you know, during the Vietnam War and all that, people say he was like a monkey jumping from here to here. But he was one who saved his country. His country remained sort of semi-neutral, but was never invaded.
Right.
You know, although he bombed like hell, but still.
Yeah.
Sihanouk and the other person, in his own way, who I admire as a leader, is King Bhumipol of Thailand. You know, his own quiet way, he's a great leader. These are people who I think, I myself personally have met, of course, others like Gandhi and all, who you read about and hear about. But
Sure. Do you think some of these qualities we've been discussing and talking about are enduring, endurable, and therefore of needs, essential? Or given the way technology is moving, given the way our interfaith engagements are moving, that we need to see the emergence of a new kind of a leader with quite a different animal from the ones we're used to?
If they don't adapt to the times and circumstances, then you cannot be a leader. You know, it must change as time goes on, the circumstances change. And if in time that, you know, there's robots take over everything, I'll be being interviewed by a robot, not by you.
Right.
And you'll be interviewing a robot also.
Thank you, sir.
Welcome.
Wonderful.
Welcome.